Good evening. Yeah, I guess Marcus isn't here to introduce me, so I guess I'll just start and introduce myself. My name's Ron Nicholson, and I'm going to be giving a presentation about the history of the Amiga 1000. Okay. So, a lot has been written about the Amiga, and when I saw a 30th anniversary event in California come up, I decided to actually read about the Amiga, and I noticed that there was a lot of interesting history, starting with the introduction of the Amiga 1000, and a lot of the history from before that period of the development of the product was completely missing. So Joe Tocure and myself got together and put together a presentation to try to cover the period from the initial inception of the idea of doing a product like the Amiga and the efforts taken and some of the people involved. So I want to talk a little bit about, after the introduction, about the business background that led to the founding of Toro, which preceded Amiga, some of the technological environments of the design, which are completely different from how things are designed today, some of the marketing goals that the initial design team were given, and some of the key features we came up with to essentially create the initial Amiga 1000 product. So who am I? So I dug through my notebooks a while back and found my old Amiga business card. I was initially hired as employee number 11 at Amiga, and my title was the Director of Hardware Engineering. Most of the people at Amiga before me were involved in designing the Atari peripherals, not on the Amiga computer itself. I was the first person to start working on that, and I worked with Jay Miner and Joe Tocure as the initial design team. Now, I was told to tell some stories, and the stories, I'll start with a topical story. There's a movie coming out, I think actually two movies coming out, on Steve Jobs. And so I'm going to start out telling a Steve Jobs story. Now you may ask, what does Steve Jobs have to do with the Amiga? And it turns out, from my perspective, quite a bit. At Apple Computer, I was working on the Macintosh project, and the story I have to tell is I was sitting at a lab bench next to Dan Kotke's lab bench, and he was wire wrapping a board. I don't know, actually doing point-to-point wiring to build one of the earliest Macintosh prototypes. And Steve Jobs comes up and asks, "What are you doing?" It's the classical elevator thing. You don't want to be around Steve Jobs if he comes up and asks, "What are you doing?" But Dan Kotke's known Steve Jobs for many years and knows how to deal with it. He says, "Oh, I'm putting a test connector on the Macintosh motherboard." And Steve Jobs, "What for?" And he says, "Well, to get some test signals out, but I also want to experiment, try to, add some stuff onto the Mac." And Steve Jobs goes, "Add what?" And Dan Kotke's, "Well, something like that, like a color output, so I can, try to see some color out of the first Macintosh," which is strictly a monochrome a machine. And Steve Jobs comes up and says, "Take that off, rip that test connector off. I don't want anyone building any color on the Macintosh. We're going to build monochrome personal computers." And I'm sitting at the lab bench next to this, listening to this all happening quietly, like a mouse on the side, to not get involved. But I said to myself, I would do a color 68,000 personal computer. And it turns out the next week I went out to lunch with Jay Miner. So how did I get to know J Minor? It turns out that also involved Steve Jobs. On the Macintosh motherboard, there's a clock chip. And when Burl Smith was designing the board, he looked at available clock chips and wanted to figure out what clock chip to use. And Steve Jobs, and Burl are looking over the options, and Steve looks at the available solutions. He says, those are too ugly. We don't want to put these existing clock chips on the Macintosh. We have to do our own custom clock chip. But anyway, what that comes to is I was commissioned to look at a primary source for a clock chip, and that was Synertech, which turns out to be a company that J Minor actually helped found about a decade previously. And he put me in touch. He gave me this phone number and said, here is someone I worked with at Atari. He is the best chip designer I know, and he handed me J Minor's phone number and had me call him up. So it turns out the first chip that J Minor and I worked on for a 68,000 base personal computer had nothing to do with the Amiga. It was the clock chip on the original Mac 128K. So that was our first project working together. And then, in the course of the project, I went out to lunch, and after Steve Jobs said he didn't want to do a color computer, and J Minor said he did, my choice was obvious. So that's my connection with the founding of Amiga. So telling some stories about people. So, the technical energy involves a lot of connections and genealogy. Ooh, my slide skip past one. Where did it go? So, I wanted to talk a little about the genealogy, the connection between companies now. In Silicon Valley, there are thousands of startups, and people have tried to draw a chart of the connections between them, and it becomes an eye chart because there are just 1,000 companies. So I simplified it, just a piece of it down to the companies involved in the creation of the Amiga. And we have this one path down here, which my co-presenter, the earlier inventor, Tocure, was involved with, of Cyan Engineering, who created the first prototype for the Atari 2600. Atari purchased them and introduced Tocure to J Minor, and they did the Atari 2600, and later Tocure became the system architect for the Atari 400-800. This path is fairly interesting. This path is the path of the money, because any company, any development project requires money. These days, people spend on the order of billions of dollars to develop the latest microprocessors and modems for cell phones and stuff like that. So the path that led to the Amiga started with cardiologists. So cardiologists wanting to make the first implantable pacemakers and defibrillators. How that led to the Amiga was they formed a company. Part of it is an investment, part of it is, I heard, a tax shelter. But anyway, they formed a company to make pacemakers, and back in the late 70s and early 1980s, the chip companies could not exactly provide suitable chips. They didn't specialize in building the chips needed for medical implants. So they saw an opportunity to form a new semiconductor company who would specialize in doing medical semiconductor electronics. And that was formed by Burt Braddock, and that was Zymos, again funded by Intermedics, the pacemaker company. The same people involved in providing the money for both companies. Now, as you know, a semiconductor fab line requires a huge volume of chips to run. You don't build $1 billion fab line to build 2 chips. You build $1 billion fab line to build billions of chips. Now, back then, the fab lines didn't cost billions, but they still cost many millions. And to create the volume of chips from Zymos, they decided, well, we've got to fund a company that's a consumer of large volumes of chips. And what was the only consumer of large volumes of chips back then, one of the few, was a video game. So they said, well, let's form a video game company. And I'm not sure exactly how Dave Morse and the funders got connected, but they got connected. Dave Morse was the vice president of marketing at Tonka Toys. And so they put a toy marketing expert together with people who wanted to fund high volume chip production and essentially put the money to form High Toro. Now, via a channel of things, I think Larry Kaplan was involved, but anyway, Dave Morse got introduced to Jay Miner, and they formed the company High Toro, which later, when everybody in the company decided High Toro didn't mean much to them as a game company, renamed it Amiga. I think that name was thought up by Dave Morse. So I told you a little bit about the connection about how I was involved. I started at a company called BTI Computer Systems, where I worked with a brilliant software type, Bob Pariseau, and engineer Dave Dean, who later I would bring with me to Amiga. I worked at Apple for a while, on Apple II peripherals, the computer that Steve Wozniak designed, and later, pretty much, Rod Holt came over and said, we want you on the Mac team, and pretty much just dragged me out of the Apple II group, and I started working on custom chips for the Mac project. And then I told you again how Steve Jobs gave me a number, said, call this guy up, and this guy, Jay Miner, talked me into starting with him on the project to do a color video game, which would be a high-volume consumer of custom chips. So let's see, I talked a little bit about this. The sad story is that the custom chips suitable for medical electronics were too slow for a high-performance game machine, so it turned out that we did not turn out to be the source that they wanted for Zymos. Zymos no longer exists as a semiconductor company. So Joe Tocure, when I gave this presentation earlier, Joe Tocure was my co-presenter. He, again, worked with Jay Miner on the 2600, and he liked to say, working at a game machine company, designing games and then testing the games as a result, he said, they're paying me to do this? Yeah, and a lot of us at Amiga thought the same thing. We just thought we were designing the greatest thing, and come to work saying, they're paying me to do this, and I get to do this? It was a great thing. So Joe Tocure was actually a system architect for the Atari 400-800 system, and took a leading role as one of the system architects of the Amiga. Again, there were 3 custom chips in the Atari 400-800, and a lot of the same constraints led to us doing a 3-chip solution for the Amiga 1000. So here is something very interesting. This is something from Joe Tocure's notebook. Apparently, Atari was smart enough in thinking about the innovator's dilemma. They thought, what was next after the Atari 2600? We have to do something so that, another company doesn't jump in. And that was one of the reasons behind doing the later Atari products. But when the time came to do the next product after the Atari 400-800, they got cold feet. And Jay Miner actually went to them and said, we want to do a 16-bit version of the Atari. And they canceled the project, and shortly thereafter, that was why Jay Miner and Joe Tocure left working at Atari. Joe Tocure went on to do a signal processing company, and Jay Miner went to found Zymos. I think it was the 4th or 5th company he actually founded in Silicon Valley. So this slide belongs up in the introduction. But anyway, who am I and how am I involved? Well, the first three people working on the Amiga architecture were, of course, Jay Miner and then Joe Tocure and myself. Joe Tocure worked as a consultant for the project. He actually never came on as a full-time employee. And the work we did led to the 4 seminal patents of the Amiga. And Jay, Joe, and I are named on all 3. There are additional names, including Glenn Keller and Dave Dean, named on subsequent ones. So let's see. I already talked about this. So what was the existing technology of the day? Well, the most interesting constraints were, well, let's see. Yeah, basically the products we had to compete with back then were the Atari VCS video games. You know, this is way before Nintendo and other companies came along. The Apple II and the IBM were the top-selling personal computers, and this is the original 8-bit 8088 4.77 megahertz. Memory cost a lot of money. 64 kilobytes of memory was on the order of $100 back then. Adjusting for inflation, that might I'd have to do the calculations, but that might be over 200 euros for just 64K of memory. So the idea of doing a computer with that amount of memory or more, a lot of the constraints about, you know, why the registers are so small are because we couldn't design a chip for much more memory back then, a system. 4-micron NMOS is also interesting. As you know, we're down to the chips in cell phones now are 20 nanometers, you know, roughly 20 nanometers. What is that? Let's. I think we calculated that if we were to take the transistors we used for the Amiga and put modern technology overlaid on top of it, that you could put most of one of the entire custom chips we developed in current technology on top of one NAND gate in 4-micron NMOS. The order of magnitudes are like over 100,000 to 1 in area density of transistors between now and back then. So basically a whole chip could be done where we did one transistor back then. And one of the biggest constraints was nowadays many of the chips in the modern products have several hundred pins. The only packages for the chips that were available back then were 48 pins. And as it turns out, you have to count up the number of signals that you can get from here to there very carefully when you only have 48 pins. And that led to some of the reasons in the Amiga architecture why the video bitmaps and such and registers are of certain size. So if you're an Amiga programmer and you wonder why isn't this register, can't it address more memory, it's that we didn't have enough pins to get the address lines out. That was, yeah, that's, sometimes the constraints are things you have to deal with. Okay, so Dave Morse, the originally founding CEO, president of Amiga, was a former VP of marketing at Tonka Toys, and he had a marketing goal for the Amiga. Basically, product tie-ins were how the toy company sold lots of toys back then, similar to like how Disney does it now when they come out with a movie and they have a ton of toys to go along with it. Basically, whenever something popular came out, Dave wanted to be able to build a video game that could be co-marketed along that. And we talked about rendering cartoon and cartoon-like games. Back then, you know, Pong and stuff like that with rectangles and stuff like that were the dominant theme in game animation, and spaceships and stuff like that. But he wanted to actually do something like cartoons. And back then, a character called the Smurfs was very popular among kids. And so he joked about, how do we animate a Smurf? And of course, in the Apple II games of that time, there was some crude animation, and so we decided if we wanted to do a game machine, we had to be able to do it at least 10 times, maybe more, as fast as the fastest machines could do it in software. So that was the goal the hardware team was given, to be able to do animation of cartoon-like characters and sprites at least 10 times faster to keep ahead of the competition. And even though we were chartered to do a game machine for high volume, Jay Miner thought ahead and said, well, Moore's Law and various other things, the computer industry will move on, things will get bigger. And so he specified enough expansion options, I/O ports and stuff like that, so we could keep on adding on to this project and make it extensible into a full computer and not just a game console. And that turned out to be very fortuitous when the whole game industry crashed in 1984. It turned out that co-marketing games by tie-ins with entertainment, the Atari overdid that, and there was the infamous thing where they had to bulldoze a million ET cartridges because they just thought that any movie character would be popular. It turns out, no, the game actually has to be fun and playable, and they sort of lost that. So let's see. Yeah, summary. We merged some game animation software technology with modern hardware architecture at that time to build a new game machine. So what did we do that was different from back then? Well, a computer output back then was fairly primitive. The Apple II and the Atari were one of the few personal computers you could hook up to a television set. Some other manufacturers made computers with their own monitors built in. But it turned out that when you hooked all these personal computers up to a VCR, the timing was designed for a computer, not for video, and it turned out you could not actually record the output of an Apple II or an Atari on a VCR, on a videotape recorder. So we did a lot of work to make sure we could actually get accurate video timing, and that turned out to be very seminal because the Amiga turned out to be a video development company because we built the video good enough to be gen-locked and stuff like that so it could be used for video production. So that turned out to be a major advance in the Amiga architecture over existing machines. A lot of, instead of designing a lot of special purpose units inside the Amiga, a concept used in mainframe computers for many decades before the Amiga, I think invented at IBM, was called a direct memory access, DMA. And basically it's a way of offloading the processor and allowing coprocessor engines to handle all the I/O. So it's how IBM, with a single processor back then, could still handle a single, fairly slow by today's standards processor, could still run an entire bank and run many, back then it was tape drives, card punches, or whatever, as they offloaded it onto direct memory access coprocessors. And we decided to bring that technique from the mainframes and actually put it in a game machine as one of our innovations. So it turned out that actually simplified the design, and the fact that we generalized a lot of the I/O to direct memory access to the registers allowed the game programmers to do stuff that we never imagined they could do with the generalized memory access engines. Another key thing that we added to the Amiga was the BitBlit technology, which of course was pioneered at the University of Utah and Xerox PARC, and that was technology that was being used in software by the Apple Lisa, which one of the first personal computers to use it was in development at Apple. It wasn't introduced at this time. It was the Apple Lisa still came out about half a year after we started on the Amiga design. And game programmers also roughly used the same idea in writing video games for the Apple II. Apple II did not have a Sprite engine, unlike the Atari. And so if an Apple II programmer wanted to make an Atari-like video game, they had to do the Sprite hardware character moving on the screen. They had to do that strictly writing it in software. And they used ideas fairly similar to BitBladder technology. At the Amiga original design, we decided to put that in hardware and make a hardware engine that actually could read and write bitmaps of memory, put the characters on display with very little time, very little path length of the software to actually have the software do it in code all the time. Another innovation, interesting, again, memory was limited. The amount of bits of information per pixel, per dot on the screen was fairly limited. Nowadays, I think compression formats like JPEG are fairly easily understood. It turns out that that technique actually worked in part of our video format in the Amiga. It's essentially a form of differential encoding to compress certain types of data, where instead of specifying the color of every pixel, you specify the difference from the preceding pixel. It's called differential encoding. It's a common compression methodology, and it's used in software compression. We actually put that in hardware, and back then we didn't know the proper name for it, so it got named hold and modify, but it really, in modern technology, it's compression by differential encoding. And then another thing we added, instead of simple beeps and boops, was a sampled sound synthesizer. Tocure was involved in digital signal processing for audio, and at Apple I had been involved with some audio experiments also, and knew that waveform synthesis could produce a lot more interesting sounds. That was considered an innovative idea back then. Nowadays it's fairly standard. Everybody does samplers, but essentially we built one of the first samplers in silicon for the Amiga. And again, to generalize it, since we had direct memory access, so we could just build as many audio engines as there was room for in the chip, and there's room for 4 channels of sampled audio synthesis, and we didn't do it. Nowadays you do filtered resampling. We sort of just changed the rate at which the wavetables could be sampled out, but that turned out still to be useful enough for a lot of audio effects, and the Amiga was capable of much more than a typical personal computer at the day. And again, the very programmers took that and again made sounds and amazing things that we did not completely expect. Okay. I talked a little about most of this already. The part of the Amiga that I was least involved with is the Sprite Engines. Tocure was the architect of the Sprite Engines in the Atari 2600 and the Atari 400. So Amiga had the capability of both doing the BitBlit, inspired by Xerox, Alta, and Apple Lisa, and the Sprite Engines inspired by the Atari video games. So the technical heritage of the Amiga has multiple sources, both from large computers, the direct memory access, BitBlitting from Xerox, Sprite Engines from Atari. All essentially the genealogy of computer technology, how innovations are made by taking combinations of technologies used in the past and putting them together in innovative and interesting ways. So I talked a little bit about the copper already. One of the differences that we did to make the generalized memory access suitable for a game machine was the DMA was actually synchronized to the beam position. You go, what is beam position? I don't know. Do they still have PAL televisions over in Europe? Is it all gone flat panel digital? But PAL TV and NTSC, essentially the dots are drawn on the screen line by line, and it takes roughly 60 times a second in the US, 50 times in Europe to draw one frame dot by dot. And it turned out we synchronized all the effects in the Amiga with the dot position. So at any particular location in the screen, you could completely change the configuration of the chip. And again, that led to a lot of the capabilities that people used in the video toaster for special effects, changing the display depending on the geometric position on the screen. And it was fairly generalized. Instead of having the audio engine and the Sprite engine have their own specialized ways of accessing memory, we pretty much generalized it all to direct memory access, where almost any memory could be moved onto any register, positions, colors, blitter operations, and people used that to program the Amiga, again, to do very innovative things. So providing a general solution allows a lot of flexibility for really brilliant software people to do stuff that the hardware people couldn't even think of. Let's see, this is one of Joe Tocure's slides, but it's good. It has the basic Amiga architecture. You'll notice that the names on the chips, a lot of them have changed multiple times. When I started, it was really originally Agnes and Daphne and Portia, and as time went on, the chips were renamed several times, but they always start with the letter A, D, and P. But anyway, the direct memory access and the chip elimination allowed us to move data directly from memory into the various chips as needed, with, of course, the 68,000 16-bit processor back then, which is, again, a slight advancement from the 8-bit chips that were previously used, the 6502 and the Z80. Okay. So why bit planes? Well, there are multiple reasons to use bit planes. Actually, this slide is out of order, but the main reason that we used bit planes instead of nowadays you have 32-bit color and various other formats was one bit plane at PAL resolution filled up almost 32K of memory. And if you're trying to build a system with only 64 or 128K, you can't use many bits for each pixel, or else you'll have any full screen image will be larger than all of memory. So in retrospect, it'd be nice if we used a more modern format, that was extensible to stuff today. But back then, we were fairly much limited to 1 to 6 bits per pixel. And to get the flexibility of numbers of pixels like 3 bits, and I don't know if anyone used 5, but 3 was fairly common. You had to go to a bit plane architecture instead of a packed pixel architecture. It also simplified the blitter in that the blitter did not need to vary how it processed data. It only did 1-bit pixels, and you just did multiple scans of the blitter, and that made the blitter a little simpler to design. The fact it was only dealing with 1 bit at a time per operation. Let's see, and I talked about hold and modify. We also had palette registers, so if you use some of the formats, you could do color lookup, which is one of the more common techniques back then for how to display more colors on the screen than you have bits in memory for the pixels. Yeah, this is one of Joe Tocure's slides. Again, 3-bit planes, almost 32 kilobytes of memory, and we were actually thinking of building a lower cost game machine with much less than the original 128 kilobytes it shipped with. BitBladder hardware, I don't know if I want to go into this much, but essentially it's a cut and paste, it's a cut and paste technique that uses a mask so you know what to cut and how to paste it in without overlapping too much of the background image. One of the, for the techies in the audience, for people who knew hardware design, I wanted to throw this in. It turns out that the Amiga was designed roughly at the same time that the first field programmable gate array companies, Xilinx, were started also. And a lot of people say that, you know, technology is in the environment. You know, a lot of people are inventing the same thing at the same time. And it turns out that the lookup table logic, the LUTs as they're called in field programmable gate array design, are very similar to the ALU we designed in the BitLittleIt. And for the same reason, if you want to build a generalized logic element, a lookup table is the best way to do it. And so Xilinx was inventing lookup tables for FPGAs, and at the Amiga, the hardware team, we invented essentially a lookup table as the ALU in the BitBladder logic. And a lot of it was because we were trying to figure out what logic operations would game software designers want to use, and after arguing for 2 days, we gave up and decided, well, let's just give them every possible 3-input logic operation. And so that's how we end up with a LUT at the same time the FPGA companies were designing LUTs, lookup tables as logic. Yeah, this has a lot of details of the BitBladder. I don't know if I want to point out anything special along here, except here's the lookup table logic, which is a decoder and an AND/OR array. We have a barrel shifter in front of the logic, so it can shift data back and forth by single pixels. And of course, the DNA engines that read all this data from memory and send it in pipeline fashion through the logic process to create the new BitLittleIt images. Here's an example that Joe Tocure put together, of a sprite, an outline mask, a background. You cut a hole out of the background and paste the sprite in, and that's essentially how characters are put in background using the BitBladder. Oh yeah, this slide's a good time to talk about cooperation in development. Now, we had a lot of brilliant people at Amiga, and in a small company, it's very beneficial not to compartmentalize people and have them do their specific task, and that was actually turned out to be very valuable. I actually wrote some of the first test software for the Amiga, so even though I was in the hardware team, I actually started on software with some of the software people, and Del Luck we hired to do software, but he knew a lot about hardware, and he came, he walked out of the software lab into the hardware lab and was looking at the board and looked at the logic diagrams and say, hey, if we add this circuit over here, we could make the BitBladder do line draw. And the guy, at first we looked at him and go, but you're a software guy. He says, but I know hardware. So we sent him over to talk to Jay Miner, and he talked to Jay Miner as the thing was in design, the software team actually ended up contributing to changing the hardware and adding features. And so the line draw was actually not added by the hardware team, it was added by Del Luck from the software team. Cross-pollination and cooperation leading to innovation. And the BitBladder already had the capability to do the area fill between lines, so the addition of being able to draw lines in hardware and then fill areas in hardware with an exclusive OR array allowed filling essentially the flood fill processes that, again, allowed a lot of drawing to be done with very little software overhead. Okay, Sprite Engines. Atari VSCS had Sprite Engines. There were custom Sprite Engines. We we generalized the Sprite Engines and again allowed the DMA synchronized engine to change what the Sprite Engines could do on the fly as this going down the screen. And so even though with both the Atari, even though there were a limited number of sprites, clever game designers could reuse them and put many more sprites on display. And this enabled arcade games like Galaxian and others to be done using just sprites with a simplified programming model. This is one of Joe Tocure's slides. Again, he was involved with the Sprite Engine design. Audio. For general purpose audio engines, and DMA allowed essentially, instead of having a custom a sound unit, we allowed waveforms to be put anywhere in memory and allowed the DMA engine to fetch them from anywhere in memory. So you could actually do interesting things like put something in a video memory and then play it out as a sound. I guess some people use that to interesting effects. Yeah, and basically in a waveform synthesis, for those who don't understand, basically anything you can draw a waveform of, you can put as a sampled form in memory, sine waves, square waves for slightly harsher sound, a pseudo-random data which sounds like a noise or could be used for whooshes and bangs and boops, could be put in memory and again played out with sound engine. One of the first demos we did was Jay Miner's dog Mitzi. We got it down there with a microphone. I think it was actually connected to an Apple II. Recorded him barking, took that data, put it into the Amiga, and one of the first things we did was play him barking at various different musical pitches. So you could have a Mitzi barking out a tune, and that was one of the first demos we created to prove that you could do interesting things with the sound engine. Okay, finished interesting. I showed this slide already. So other details. I actually, as I said, I worked at Apple on the Apple II peripherals, and I had designed a serial port card for the Apple II, and one of the complaints I got back from that card was that it could not do MIDI for music input in the serial input. So that was one of the things. I had a chance to do it over again on the Amiga, and so for the Amiga serial port, I added the MIDI baud rates, and again, that turned out to be useful and helped the Amiga be successful in the uses of the music creation industry. The 3-chip partition, again, was basically, we couldn't fit all the pins on one chips. We got up to 2 and 3 chips, and at that point we decided that we couldn't afford more than 3 chips, and so a lot of the register sizes were fixed by how many pins we could get on 3 chips. The color on the Amiga, the hardware team originally had designed it for something called the YIQ, hue intensity and chroma, basically a different place in the color wheel. But Dave Needle came out, found an interesting chip, and found a way to change that to RGB, which is the way that the product eventually shipped. But again, that turned out the fact that because the chip had a lot of generalized architecture, you could change the color format without completely changing the chip. And again, I talked about Del Luck added, even though he was on the software team, helped us add line draw capability to the hardware, to the chip designs. So how did this process happen? Nowadays, chips are designed using large teams of people and a lot of computer-aided design. No one would think of doing a chip with a semiconductor chip without computers to help do things like logic synthesis, automated layout, design rule check, logic check. When we designed the Amiga, we got the chips designed The only computers that the hardware team actually had was one Apple II in the hardware lab. The software team, of course, had a small Unix computer, and the documentation people bought one of the first Apple leases to do documentation on. But basically, the hardware team, we had no real hardware, no real computer assist in the design. This was all done on sheets of paper and sheets of a plastic paper called BitLittleIt, colored pencils. We had lots of colored pencils and opaque tape that you could actually use to put rectangles down on the plastic paper for each transistor. This thing was designed, each transistor, by hand. So I've sort of skipped down into the middle. So what happened before that? So for the first 3 months, it was Joe Tocure, Jay Miner, and myself. Dave Morse pretty much locked us in a large conference room with 3 whiteboards, and our job was just to scribble on the whiteboard until we could figure out something that worked. And so that was the first 3 months of work. I actually hand wire wrapped one of the first 68,000 motherboards so that we could start writing initial software and test out to make sure our concepts of memory timing worked back then. Then, as I said, at a former job, I had worked with Bob Pariseau and Dave Dean, and so I hired them to Amiga. Jay Miner at Atari had worked with David Chu and Mark Shu, and he brought them in to start doing circuit design, basically figuring out the size of the transistors and doing spice modeling for any of you who do hardware design. And given that we had no computer-aided design tools, no logic simulators or synthesizers, we built very large emulators for the chips out of individual TTL parts. These are little black, for those of you who don't know what they are, they're little black things about the size of a nut that contained, maybe 4 NAND gates or 4 registers. And so we're building a chip which had, on the order of over 50,000 transistors, and to figure out if it worked, we had to wire together millions of little jelly bean-sized chips, and some of you have seen the pictures. Del Luck, I think, is still keeper of one of the Amiga prototypes with very large towers of chips wire wrapped together. Given the number of wires and the number of connections, we were very lucky that thing actually stayed working as much as it did. But Dave Needle also has stories about debugging it and keeping it working, because when you have that many thousands of wires, jiggling the thing, you worry it'll still work. We took that to the CES, the famous CES trade show in 1984. I think I was looking through my stuff the other day and actually found an artifact from that. Let's see if I can go forward to that. Here it is. Here is my exhibitor badge from the 1984 International Winter Consumer Electronics Show, where we took the chip emulators down, and in a closed room under NDA to specific game developers and potential investors, we made the first sort of secret showing of what the Amiga could do, and of course, a little bit leaked out to the press. But for various reasons, we didn't let any of the press in, only people under legal non-disclosure agreement. But anyway, so that happened in '84, and then again, we had no design tools, so after the chips were laid off, drawn by pencil, taped out by tape on BitLittleIt, we spent many late nights going over and manually checking with little rulers to make sure all the transistors and all the spacing were the correct size. You talk to people doing chips nowadays, and basically they, I think the fact that we succeeded as considered by a modern chip designer, would be considered, extremely difficult to do a chip this large. No one does chips of this size or even smaller anymore without computer-aided design tools. So we got, we thought we were good, but I think we were also very lucky that we got this thing working with the small team that we had without any design tools, with the complexity and large number of transistors in the chips. Now, as you know, the game industry also crashed in 1984. They overproduced too many video games. Inventory built up. A lot of software game developers went bankrupt because they spent too much money on cartridges that no one bought. Atari famously bulldozed games into a hole in the ground just to get rid of them. And so Dave Morse is trying to figure out, what do we do? The game market's dying. Well, it turns out that Jay Miner and I and Joe Tocure had put enough stuff into the game machine logic that we could pretty quickly pivot it into being the personal computer that you know today, with the disk controllers and the serial ports and the keyboards and all the other stuff that the original product was not conceptualized as having. Those were considered just add-ons or enhancements. The software team took this stuff, and when we got the 3 chips working, started working on the now famous multitasking Amiga OS, and then after many months of revising the hardware, the first product came out a year later. That was the Amiga 1000, introduced at Lincoln Center in 1985. And let's see, is that pretty much... so as I said, there's some commonality between the Atari and the Amiga, and between Apple and the Amiga, and there's another artifact that exists. This one, it's hard to see, but here's Steve Jobs' signature, Woz's signature, and they let the whole design team design the case, so mine ended up somewhere in the middle here. And I told Jay Miner that we were doing this at Apple, and he said, well, we can't just let them do it, and so we did something similar. And so here's some signatures: Jay Miner, Dave Morse, Mitzi's paw, and I also got to sign what got put textured in the plastic of the Amiga 1000. So that's a little bit of proof that I was actually involved in this great, amazing project. And what's the summary? Innovative design, 3 full custom ASICs for a chip of that complexity and capability, an insanely small team of really excellent engineers I worked with, and we added enough upside to it and creative and innovative features that the software people and game developers could create a system that is still popular among an amazing number of people. We could never have imagined that 30 years later there would still be people be interested in me talking about something that I designed way back then. And that's to learn more. There are books on the Amiga out. There's actually another book in process being written by Bill Bagnell coming out on the Amiga. And let's see. And again, this talk, sort of the whole Amiga is in memory of Jay Miner. He passed away, I think, 19 years ago. And he was our leader, a mentor, as I said, a founder of 5 companies in Silicon Valley. The project wouldn't have existed without him. So the Amiga is sort of in memory of one of the seminal creative minds in hardware in Silicon Valley. And I've got my contact info here. You can find me in email or Twitter, and that's the end of my presentation. I thank you very much for your time and listening to me rambling on out here about what we did. Thank you. Thank you.